Now, D Block didn't always look like this. D Block, for many, many years, from 1934 on, was a segregation block. In other words, there were big cells like are on the second floor and third floor. There were open cells. Down here at these isolation cells, these were the ultimate in isolation from 1941 on. But before 1941, if you'll look at the steel plate that's on the floor, that metal flooring there, if you open it, leads to what's called the dungeons of Alcatraz. Now, these dungeons are no more than the very first level of the citadel, which was the very first living quarters of any consequences that was built on the Alcatraz in the 1860s. It was for the officers and their wives. It was right at this location where it was. When this prison was built in the 1911-12 era, they tore the citadel down and left the first floor of the citadel and built the prison on top of it. That's the infamous Spanish dungeons. Now, I've been down there, and for all the time I lived here, we thought they were Spaniards. We were always told it was Spaniards. Even the inmates that were here thought they were Spaniards, but there were never any Spaniards on this island. Up until 1941, they would occasionally, for that kind of inmate that this called for, they would take him down there and put him in cells that were there from the Army days and handcuff them to the bars, because they were soft steel bars, and leave them there for periods of time. Now, this is truly spooky. It's dark, the water's dripping, there are rats down there, and you are alone. Well, the story I like to tell is about the fellow inmate by the name of Charlie Berta. Because in going through this prison with my father in the last years of his life, during one of his comments, he said, you know, the toughest inmate I ever came across was Charlie Berta. And that impressed me because my father was one tough guy. He'd been a Marine in the 20s. He'd been to China. He'd hitchhike across the country. He'd done a lot of things, and his story goes on and on. He had also been a Leavenworth correctional officer over 10 years before they transferred him here. So when he says this guy was one of the toughest men he ever come across, my ears picked up. Charlie Berta. Charlie Berta was a San Francisco boy. He was in trouble by the time he was 10 years of age. He ultimately ended up at Alcatraz here in the late 30s and into the 40s. Charlie Berta did end up in San Francisco in a bar where my father used to drink beer with him. But other officers had experiences with Charlie. One of former officers from here was a security officer at the Bank of America at Powell and Market Street, where the cable car turns around. And one morning when he opened the doors to the bank, Charlie Berta was in front. Charlie Berta looked at the officer's face and says, no, 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 he says, Mr. whoever his name was, I'm just here to make a deposit, not a withdrawal. That officer said, Charlie scared the hell out of me when I opened the door and he was standing in front. So, Charlie Berta story.